Hi, I'm Jay from RS Garage. Today we're going to walk through the installation of an OEM Toyota 2JZ oil pump. There are three problems that you're trying to avoid by following the steps I'm going to show you in this video. First is getting any corrosion that's present inside of the oil pump removed. Second is making sure that the bypass valve is free to move inside of its bore. And last but not least is the center line of the oil pump housing and its relationship to the center line of the crankshaft, making sure that there's ample clearance between the drive gear of the oil pump and the oil pump housing itself. As I go through this video, I'm going to show you some measurements with my mics, but all the things that you need to worry about and you need to have within your control can be had without any special tools. We're going to be using some sandpaper, some Dicom, some patience, and a little bit of your favorite lubricant. So with all that said, let's get the oil pump out of the box, get it taken apart, and take a look at what we have inside. Now I have this little jig that I use to hold the pump still, but you don't necessarily need it. It just makes it easier for me to do my work. This is a GTE oil pump, and if you're converting a GE engine to turbo duty, I recommend that you use the GTE oil pump. I have a number 3 Phillips on an impact driver, and I'm going to remove all of the screws that hold the backplate on. Now my impact driver is from Snap-on. I recommend using a quality tool here because if you break the bit off in the screws, you're going to just make the work harder for yourself. I can pop the gears up out of the oil pump and take a quick peek for corrosion. These look pretty good, just a few spots here and there that we can easily clean off. Now, this is an unopened Toyota oil pump, and if you look inside of the housing, there's almost no lubrication present. And that's where a lot of your problems are stemmed from, just a lack of lubrication during startup. So you put assembly oil on your bearings, assembly oil on your camshafts, but what's going on inside of your oil pump? Now I can take the bypass valve out and see if it's stuck in its bore and inspect it for corrosion. You want to be careful to not nick or damage any of these machined surfaces inside the oil pump. The bypass slid out. We can quickly insert a reel of me knocking a bypass out that was frozen in a pump, but this one was not frozen. Well, it's stuck. Yeah. Using your fingernail, you can feel around on the valve, and there are some raised areas of kind of leftover burry material from machining. We're going to go ahead and polish those down. While these little spots of rust don't look severe on the gears, keep in mind that the clearance between the oil pump housing and the oil pump backplate, the tight side of the specification is less than 1/1000th of an inch. The loose side of the specification is under 3/1000th of an inch. So it doesn't take a lot of particulate or debris inside the pump to rotate in the pump and scar it up. So we're going to use some fine sandpaper and some light oil and do a little bit of polishing. I've got 1000 grit sandpaper. I'm not using a lot of pressure. As I work my way around the gear, I'm also taking the opportunity to kind of break this edge on the gear. You're not going to be removing much material. You're just knocking the tight edges off. Now after I've touched it with some 1000 grit, I can move to some 2000 and do the same thing again. If you look close, you can see the machining marks on the gears. If anything, you're just going to be knocking the peaks off of those marks. You're not taking a measurable amount of material off here. Take note that there's a small dot on the driven gear of the pump. You're going to be looking for that later in the job. Take note of the dot that's on the oil pump drive gear. You'll be looking for it later. Shifting our attention to the oil pump housing, you want to look at the machine surfaces involved. This pump looks pretty good inside. There's a little bit of a shine or luster to the machine surfaces, and when you drag your nail across it, there are no measurable gouges. Not all of the oil pumps look this good when you take them apart. With that being said, we're going to take a little bit of that 1000 grit sandpaper, and we're just going to walk through and knock the edges off the inside of the oil pump. We're not looking for any sort of perceived flow increase or anything like that. We're just taking the edges off because this pump housing is going to have a little bit of movement, and as it's moving around, you want it to meet a round edge, not a sharp edge. I've touched all the edges with 1000 grit. Now I'm going to move to a 2000 grit and just go over these hard edges again. We're just trying to break the edges off. We're not trying to modify or remove material or anything like that. We're just making sure that we don't have any sharp edges for any of the parts to meet each other in. Same thing with the oil pump backplate. We're just going to take some fine sandpaper and break the edges off. Now we can shift our attention to the oil pump bypass valve. Got some fine sandpaper. We're just going to run over the edges and the piston itself. And if you are feeling around with your fingers, you'll see that it smooths right out. Before I address the drive gear anymore, I just want to measure, because I want to illustrate the clearance between the oil pump drive gear and the oil pump housing itself. So we have a number that we've landed on here, 2.40745, and we can measure the ID or the bore of the oil pump housing and check the clearance at room temp. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the clearance between the housing and the drive gear gets pretty tight. This one is on the looser side, so I have 2.5 thousandths in the vertical range, and I have almost 3 thousandths in the horizontal range. I've seen these again 1.5 and 2 thousandths, so this is on the high side, and what we're really trying to avoid in this video is you being the victim of stacking tolerances, where if you had a crankshaft that wasn't centered in this perfectly and you had a housing that was on the low side of clearance, then the oil pump drive gear can get into this oil pump housing and make a real mess. As we move towards oil pump alignment on the crankshaft, we want to take a look at this drive gear. And what you want to do is take your fingernail and drag it across the snout of the drive gear and feel the surface that you're dealing with. It's pretty toothy. And if you take your finger and you drag it into the pump housing where this is going to ride into, it's also pretty toothy. So if you get into a situation where the oil pump drive gear is forced up against that housing in any manner, and you have this toothy steel touching that aluminum, it's going to start dragging that material and make a mess. And that's where you see some of these photos on the internet where there's oil pump housings that are all just ruined, and the clearance between this and the pump housing wasn't enough, and the surface finish on this was aggressive enough that once they met, it just started dragging material. So we're going to, again, take some sandpaper and we're going to work this down to just smooth it out. We're just taking the tops off of the peaks. I normally do this in my lathe because it makes it quick work, but I'm assuming you don't have a lathe at home, so it'll just be a hand job. Now some passes with some 600 grit, and we've already got those peaks knocked down. We'll move to 1,000 and keep working on it. We'll now move to a 2,000 just for some final buffing and move to the next step. Now the part may not look much different to the naked eye, but again, your fingernail and fingertips are pretty neat tools for a thing like this, and as you drag your nail across the part, it is significantly smoother. So while I mentioned this pump housing looks pretty nice, as we feel around in here, it's still a bit sharp. So we're going to do the same thing, just some fine sandpaper. We're not trying to remove material, we're just taking the peaks off. We're just smoothing it out and breaking the edges. This is one of those things, like these internet guys that are constantly working with gloves, you don't really get the luxury of feeling things with your fingertips. So this is the situation that you're going to have to use your bare hands and feel around and make sure that you don't have any sharp edges in here. Now, a sharp edge on the aluminum will likely get knocked down. Sharp edge on the steel gear is likely to pick up aluminum and start making a mess. So this is not as critical as polishing the snout of the oil pump drive gear, but I'd say it's just as important because you're just going through the steps. If you don't have a parts washer, some brake clean will work just fine, but you want to make sure that you remove any of the stuff that has fallen off the sandpaper or any of that aggregate, because you don't want it in the pump. While you're cleaning the parts, it's not a bad opportunity to kind of run your fingertips over those edges again, making sure that you're happy with how all that turned out. Down inside of the spline for the gears, there can be corrosion in there. So if you have a little bit of Scotch-Brite, it's not a bad time to scrub through the splines and get them cleaned out. In case any of you are wondering how much material has been removed, 2732, so 0.0002 of an inch was removed with the sanding. So again, it's not a game of removing material, it's just a game of smoothing out the edges. So as you drag your fingers around inside this pump, what were sharp edges before are not, but if you just glance at it, it doesn't look any different than when we started. Now to check the alignment with the oil pump and the crankshaft, we're going to take some Dykem and we're going to paint the oil pump where the snout of the oil pump drive gear goes through it. Now as that dries, we can go over a quick anatomy of the pump. We have an oil inlet, an oil outlet, the oil bypass hole, which is going to bleed pressurized oil back into the oil inlet as needed when the engine is cold. You have a trough for sealant. When you install your oil pump, the silicone should follow this trough and leave these small half-moon troughs empty. These are designed for overflow, so the sealant spooges out of this trough, can enter this trough without getting into the O-ring or the orifices. These two enlarged holes on the pump are going to be located on the dowels that are on your 2JZ engine block. Make sure that the dowels are in the block. If you bought a new block from Toyota, you have to install the dowels as part of the installation. If you want to get into ported oil pumps, there's not a lot of room to create radiuses on either the inlet or the outlet. You can chase the edge down, but there's not enough material or tool path to make a really nice short turn radius. Now before we put the oil pump on the engine, it's worth noting that the oil pump drive gear does have lash or play. You want to make sure that the gear floats freely and that there isn't a burr on either part that's going to cause it to hang up. Now we can take the oil pump drive gear, drop it into the housing, put our back plate on. We just need a couple of screws for this test. We're going to put the oil pump on the engine, rotate the crankshaft, and the Dykem is going to let it be a witness to whether or not there is contact between the oil pump drive gear and the oil pump housing. Here are your dowels that are in the engine block that the oil pump is going to locate onto. We're going to line up the splines, slide the pump onto the dowels, and just install a couple of bolts. Now rotate the crankshaft. Take the pump back off and check for witness marks. What you're looking for is any drag marks on the inside of this housing. The Dykem is very, very thin and will scrape off if contact is made. So this housing looks good. We can give it a final clean and move towards assembly. With the pump housing clean and dry, I just wanted to point out two more things before we move towards assembly of the oil pump. When you install your front main seal, there's a lip here inside of the pump housing to stop the seal. So as you install that seal, make sure that it's all the way down seated in the pump. You should be able to see the chamfer at the top of the seal between the oil pump and the seal. So we'll go ahead and put a picture of the screen of what that oil pump seal looks like when it's fully installed. Also, there's a small hole in the pump right here. This is going to bleed oil that collects behind the seal down out of the pump. So it's an oil pump, there's oil being pressurized, there's oil kind of leaking here and there, and you don't want to hydraulic the front main seal out. So take a look and make sure that that hole in the bottom of the oil pump is clean and clear. Now we made a note of this little square in the face of the drive gear. We're just going to mark that tooth on the back side, and we are going to use a quality engine assembly lube and get this gear pretty wet. Same thing with the driven gear. Driven oil, driven gear. And we're going to drop this in, and the dots that are on both the drive and the driven gear should be facing up. Just makes it easy to assemble the pump. Bit more assembly lube on the back. You can even rub some down into the splines so they're lubricated. A little bit on the back plate where the gears are going to be touching. While my hands are still oily, I can lubricate the bypass valve and put it into its port. Wash my hands up and get the screws in. I'm going to put a little bit of red thread locker on these screws. You would normally use blue on aluminum because red is not coming out, but this oil pump's going on and it will last the life of the engine. When it comes off, it will go in the garbage can. So I can just use the red Loctite and not have to worry about anything ever coming loose. The back plate screws go to 8 foot-pounds. And as I go, I mark them. That way if I'm interrupted, I know where I left off. Now my last step before I can put this pump on the engine is reinstalling the bypass valve spring. I've got a little bit of oil on the O-ring, and I've got a spacer in my socket. And I'm going to just push this into its little home and catch that first thread. Now the hardware for the bypass valve gets torqued to 22 foot-pounds. And that's it. Pump is ready to go on the engine. Now that I've gone through the steps of showing you what it takes to have a successful oil pump installation, you can make the decision to follow these steps or not. If you're not going to follow the steps, I stress at a minimum, please pour oil into the inlet of the oil pump, rotate the oil pump with your fingertips until it comes out of the outlet of the oil pump, and let the oil pump sit on its face. Let a little bit of time go by, flip the pump over, let it sit on its back, excessive oil will drain out. From there, you can work towards installing the pump on the engine, but you do not want to create a situation where you're dry starting the oil pump. It will make a lot of work for you moving forward, and you can avoid it with about an hour's worth of prep time. There will be a fair share of propaganda coming forward about 2JZ oil pumps. As a community, all we can do is ask for data. So if somebody wants to develop an oil pump test stand and show us that they've improved upon this pump, I am going to welcome it with open arms. Until then, try not to believe the hype. The steps that have been taken in this video can be applied to any crank-driven oil pump. So whether you're working on an engine that 3S GTE or just about anything, Subaru, crank-driven oil pump, same steps apply. Sharp edges are not your friend. Dry parts are not your friend during startup. You have assembly lube or assembly grease protecting your bearings and your lifters and your camshafts and all those parts. Do not start your oil pump up dry. You will make a mess. The tolerances between these parts are small. Make sure that you're not having tolerances stack up against you, creating a problem. If you want to purchase a prepped pump from me or another vendor, you can do that. But again, then you don't have the luxury of checking to make sure that their pump is in proper alignment on your engine block. When you align bore and engine block for main caps, it's possible that you shift the crankshaft location, and when you're dealing with a couple thousandths of an inch, you can get yourself into trouble. If you need any 2JZ related parts or speed parts in general, please keep us in mind. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.